Okay, welcome, and thank you all for joining IISS Americas for the launch of the new Strategic Survey 2016. We're joined today by three of our London colleagues, including Dr. Nick Redman, Director of Editorial at IISS and Editor of Strategic Survey. I'll turn it over to Nick in a minute for introductory remarks. I just want to make a couple of announcements. Firstly, copies of Strategic Survey are available for purchase on our website or at the front desk after the event. There's a book launch discount today, so they're only $70 each. That's a high price because it's a very packed book. So this event is being recorded and will be available for viewing tomorrow on our website. It's being streamed online, and for anyone watching online, if you'd like to ask panelists questions, you can do so via Twitter. Here's the address to which to write. And with that, I'll turn over to you, Nick.
Mark, thank you very much. One of the reasons I was so keen to bring Strategic Survey here is this is actually the 50th edition of the book. The first was published in 1967. It was only 39 pages long. You really could consume it on a very short flight. The focus is squarely on the conduct of great powers and the nature of the international system, not in an esoteric way, but quite a practical way. And that's a focus that I wanted us to take and to inform the 2016 edition. So it's a considerably shorter book than the 2015 version. My colleagues I'll bring in a moment because they're going to do most of the work rather than me, but let me make a few brief comments about the international architecture as we see it in the book. The institution, rules and norms that form this system are crumbling due to a combination of underinvestment, neglect, and overt challenge. This matters to us because in the past, international conflict could be channeled or regulated through these mechanisms. The shock absorbers of the international system worked quite effectively, but now they are being degraded and bypassed. Reasons behind this: on the institutional side, we are now faced with a structural misalignment. The balance of power as it existed in the second half of the 20th century has changed considerably, but the international architecture has not kept pace with that. Rising and reviving powers are spreading their bets. They are pushing for reform. They are floating complementary institutions, and they are also challenging the system by promoting some parallel institutions. The norms and the rules of behavior are also up for grabs. If it was suggested 25 years ago that we're all liberal capitalists now, nobody is suggesting that today. Universalism is in retreat. The WTO has been put into the sidings in Europe, in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. Regional organizations are having trouble, they're fracturing. We look at the international level. UNCLOS has suffered a severe setback through the PCA ruling and the refusal of one of the parties this year to actually abide by it. A year earlier, the principle of the inviolability of state borders taken to the cleaners in Europe over Crimea. A number of arms control treaties in Europe are tottering or have been put into abeyance. And the Kyoto Protocol and that whole regime for managing the challenge of climate change was, of course, buried at Paris in November last year. The reasons behind this I will leave mainly to my colleagues, but in short, it's an extended period of introspection and disengagement, with an element also of buyer's remorse on the part of Western states, and then aspiration, entitlement, and a sense of opportunity on the part of rising and reviving powers. I'll hand over now to my colleagues, first to Adam Ward to talk about the United States and China, then to Dr. Semyon Charuk to talk about Russia. Then I ask my colleagues, Jonathan Stevenson and Virginia Comolli, to talk about how these trends and some of these great power activities are playing out in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, respectively. And then I turn to Mark, who can bring our conversation full circle to cover the drift away from disarmament, which is emblematic of the drift in the international architecture. Adam.
It's working? Yes, great. Well, as you can imagine, the question of the role of the United States in world affairs has been a constant preoccupation in the last 50 years of Strategic Survey. And it's, again, in this current edition, for understandable reasons, very familiar to you, which is that we are now at the end of the Obama administration and have the capacity to look back a little bit, and we also have the challenging task of speculating about what the future might hold. But looking back, I think it did occur to us that in many senses the US has become what one might consider to be a more selective superpower. It's a selectivity that was based on a reasonable geopolitical calculation at the outset of the Obama administration. But one of its consequences has, we think, been to open up some strategic space that others have sought to occupy. Others, more powers in the international system, are making the geopolitical weather. And the US has been perhaps on many fronts more reactive than we're accustomed to seeing. And whether the US has the appetite or the means to recover that space is at this stage unclear, and that's indeed one of the issues that your election is intended to address and to resolve. The calculus of the Obama administration will be well known to you, a mixture of a rebalance to bring America's commitments into better balance with its shrinking resources. It was a conservative approach to the question of power. It was a matter of husbanding and conserving that power for the long term. Then there was retrenchment through disentanglement from a discretionary war in Iraq and an open-ended commitment in Afghanistan. There was a recalibration. In Europe, that meant attending really to the matter of rethinking NATO's roles and missions post-Afghanistan. Strategic savings in that theatre could be transferred elsewhere. In the Middle East, it was a question of really creating greater solidarity among the GCC countries in the necessary effort of addressing the challenges posed by a nuclearizing Iran. Asia provided the most forward-leaning aspect of the administration's policy in respect of the pivot, and that reflected a number of calculations. One, perhaps a domestic political one to advertise a distinctiveness from the prior administration, but a second one to demonstrate that this administration was trying to get to terms, if not to grips, with powers such as China. Now, events, as the saying goes, and if we look at the record up to date, it's been rather mixed. In the Middle East, the US did show itself capable of making radical tactical adjustments in response to the Arab Spring, but not perhaps in being able to impose itself decisively and strategically on the flow of the political tide. In Syria, as we'll hear from Jonathan Stevenson, the US now feels that there are no attractive options for intervention in the civil war there. Others have made a different calculation. The US succeeded, and I think we have to treat it as a first-order success in agreeing a nuclear deal with Iran, but of course it did come at the cost of aggravating the GCC and Israel, who see the deal not as an answer to the core problem of Iran's nuclear aspirations, nor a constraint on it, but ultimately a stimulant to its growing geopolitical stature. And they feel, particularly in the case of GCC and Yemen, for instance, that they have to take matters into their own hands. In Iraq, Islamic State is on the defensive and will probably shrink to the status of a virulent insurgency or guerrilla movement, but it's unclear whether the US or anybody else for that matter has the capacity to prompt changes in the political and governance structures of Iraq that would blunt the sectarianism that gives terrorism its constituency. In South Asia, the Afghanistan project hasn't failed, but it looks more fragile than all of us, I think, feel comfortable with. In Asia, the US pivot has certainly met regional demand for a greater security presence by the US to counter China, but it's initially, and in fact still, rather lopsided focus on defense and the lesser presence of any geoeconomic or trade component to that has given China a reason to present the pivot as something that is an attempt at containment and as something that justifies what has been actually a rather decisive period in its assertiveness of late. In Europe, we do see alliance solidarity, and the US has led that effort, but of course it's been in the light of the annexation of the Crimea by Russia, and NATO now confronts a Russia that is more openly aggressive, certainly less risk-averse, and seems to be less impressed with US power than previously. Now, not all of these problems can be laid at America's door, of course. It's a gigantic strategic in-tray. And we do, in Strategic Survey this year, demonstrate a number of different fronts on which the US has sought to exert leadership. But looking at matters as they stand now, and thinking ahead to the future, it's clear that what would be required if the US wanted to impose itself on all of these problems is a massive, an enormous effort of political and strategic will. And I think there are question marks about whether that is in any sense realistic at this stage. And so the question is now, having been a matter of active choice, selectivity, discrimination may be something that is in future imposed on the United States by practicalities. And there's a wider question here as well, which is whether there is not an inherent contradiction in the idea of a selective superpower. Superpowers are expected to attain and sustain a degree of strategic ubiquity and to be able to demonstrate primacy in a number of different regions simultaneously. Looking forward, I suppose the external debate, I mean, outside the United States and people looking in and following your election has obviously been rather interested by the divergent trajectories that are on offer. What one might call Trump Max would presumably be a mix of isolationism with rather hardball geopolitical instincts thrown in. It's hard to see any basis either in Europe or the Middle East or Asia, much less this hemisphere here, for constructive engagement in a way that would be attractive to the targets of it. Of course, the alternative is one in which full vent is not given to Trump's instinct if he acquires the presidency, and that the structures of US global power and US global posture sort of remain in an infrastructural sense in place, but that they're not necessarily invested with any kind of political will that instrumentalizes them in an active way. It's expected, I think, outside the United States that the Clinton administration would follow a more traditional path, emphasizing the value and the utility of alliances, and that her administration would be more forward-leaning on a number of different fronts than the Obama administration. But questions are also being asked about whether the political tumult here in the United States is going to not have the curtain come down on it after the election day, but actually be a lasting consideration and a distracting one as well. So the counterpoint to this in terms of the international scene as described in Strategic Survey is the increasing decisiveness and assertiveness of China, which we think has its root in a number of different factors, some of them domestic and some of them external. Domestically, some of them are attributable to the particular characteristics of this president, Xi Jinping, and the way in which he's accumulated power, and the way in which he seems comfortable with the exercise of that power, particularly in the questions of foreign policy. There are other domestic considerations, such as the importance that nationalism has now acquired, and that is something likely to remain in place as the Communist Party heads next year towards an important Congress. There will be a certain amount of musical chairs, there will be a certain amount of jockeying for position, and in that period it will be de rigueur for any aspiring Chinese leader to demonstrate a toughness in defense of Chinese foreign policy objectives. Externally, I think China's assertiveness has been informed by what one might think of as a narrative of the strategic incompetence of the West. In other words, that since 9/11, what one has seen from the West is a series of misdemeanors or blunders geopolitically. That economically, from 2008 onwards, we've seen the Western economic model actually ceasing to have a model characteristic and status for it as far as the Chinese are concerned. And all of this has opened up a strategic window for China. And it's a window that, as far as the Chinese are concerned, the pivot is intended to try to close. But so in the South China Sea, which I think has gained a lot of attention in the last year or so, China has moved with breathtaking speed to, as it were, literally create new grounds on which facts have been planted. But the strategic costs of doing this have not been negligible, in the sense that neighbors have been jolted into more ambitious defense modernization plans. ASEAN has resented open attempts to divide its membership. And the question that is raised more and more persistently now is China's posture with respect to the South China Sea and the East China Sea something that grows out of a particular and unique combination of political pressures, strategic interests, and other instincts, as it were, or is this a sign of further things to come on other fronts? it seems unlikely to us that the US and China will be able to agree a common, overarching, effective strategic concept for interaction going forward, partly because the South China Sea dispute has them in what I would term mirrored indignation. They both see themselves as upholding inviolable principles and very urgent pragmatic interests. With the US, it is alliance credibility on the interest side and the principle of the freedom of navigation. With the Chinese, it's the principle of the indivisibility of their sovereignty and the practical interest of domestic legitimacy. As to how the relationship is going to be affected by the outcome of your election, it's hard to make any definite statements on that front. But presumably, Trump's antipathy towards America's alliances in general, and some of the comments that he's made in respect to alliances in Asia, would point to their radical attenuation. China does not necessarily approve of America's alliance structure, but it would not actually be in its interest to see a rapid, unmanaged unraveling of those. And so I think it has got some concerns about that. Hillary Clinton would offer them something much more known, more continuity, but no real prospect of strategic comfort either. The US and China would effectively continue to play a long game in an Asian arena that's defined by geopolitical competition, an aggravation of disputes, weak institutions, and mounting militarization. Thank you.
Thanks. So the challenge as the author of one of the regional chapters in this book is to pick as what we call drivers of strategic change to basically come up with a thematic framework to analyze what is often a collection of disparate facts over the course of the year under investigation, particularly in the Russia-Eurasia region where there's been a lot going on. That was difficult for me this year. The five that were settled upon were, of course, the Russian intervention in Syria, the conflict in eastern Ukraine, the ongoing new Cold War in Russia's relations with the West, economic turbulence within the Russia-Eurasia region, resulting from a number of different factors, and Russia's deepening and increasingly asymmetric partnership with China. So in my remarks here, because we have a lot of colleagues on the stage, I'll just focus on briefly on the first three, and perhaps relate them a little bit to events that have happened since the book has gone to print. If we look back at the Russian intervention in Syria, it's important to understand I think the initial motives to get our sense about what's behind Russian behavior now. From Moscow's perspective, in the summer of 2015, there was increasing worry about the situation in Syria. The Geneva II process for a political settlement was completely stalled. The conflict, from Russia's perspective, was eventually going to lead to a violent overthrow of the Assad regime at the hands of, as they saw it, proxies of the United States and its regional allies. And so I think in the view of Putin and many in his inner circle, that would have been a big problem. That kind of an outcome would have posed major national security risks for Russia. First and foremost, it would have been another in a string of U.S.-led coercive regime change campaigns that Moscow sees as stretching from Kosovo to Afghanistan to Iraq to Libya and even the Maidan revolution in Ukraine itself. And this is sort of a part of a broader strategy, as seen in Russia, is to oust governments that had not that don't do the U.S.'s bidding and replace them with something like puppet regimes. A second factor, of course, is that Russia did not want to allow Syria to become the latest case in that string. And in that context, the ultimate fear was that this regime change pattern could, of course, lead to an attempt to do the same in Russia. Another factor in the Russian decision-making was specific to Syria. Moscow did not want the country to suffer the same fate as Libya, where the overthrow of the regime has created a power vacuum, of course, and empowered Islamic extremists. And while Western leaders continue to see Assad's removal as key to addressing the extremist threat, Putin considers the regime the only credible force that can counter the extremists. And I think these objectives really haven't changed in the last month, despite a lot of media speculation following the Aleppo offensive, or at least the intensified bombing of Aleppo. Russia's red lines on the negotiation remain unchanged. They're not going to accept coerce a regime change, nor endorse a political settlement whereby outside powers pick the winners of a civil war. But this is not simply support for Assad. Clearly, Syria, the Syrian government is and was and is Russia's proxy and the beneficiary of Russia's bombing campaign. But Moscow has never been wedded to Assad himself. Since the conclusion of the 2012 Geneva Communique, Russia has supported a political transition that would, by definition, lead to Assad's departure and reinforced that in several UN Security Council resolutions. So the Russian air campaign that we've seen has strengthened the regime for sure and weakened the opposition, but even combined with Iranian support, it cannot achieve and is not looking to achieve total military victory. And as such, given Russia's more limited objectives, even though from the very beginning Western observers predicted a quagmire for Russia in Syria, that has so far not materialized, and it might not turn out to be a quagmire. On balance, Moscow's intervention has achieved several of its objectives. It's crushed the aspirations for regime change, harbored by some opposition groups and some of Syria's neighbors, and even elements within Western governments. It's brought all the players to the negotiating table on Russia's terms, and it's weakened extremist groups, although not to the extent that is often advertised, perhaps. Furthermore, I think the intervention has had a sort of side benefit of a step change in regional and global perceptions of Russia's great power status and military capabilities, establishing Russia as a key outside power in the Middle East, even though its regional aspirations remain modest and even its regional footprint compared to that of the United States. But given that, I still would contend that the ultimate objective of the intervention was to achieve a political settlement on Russia's terms in and around Syria. Russia still hasn't gotten that, and therefore I think it's too early to say whether this Russia's first post-Soviet power projection beyond the former Soviet region was truly a success. But it does retain a relatively light footprint, which means it could go on for a long time. And it makes the sort of Afghanistan analogy a little bit faulty. But it still needs, in my view, a deal at the end of the day to fully end the violence, to counter extremism, and to minimize the cost of its presence there. And so far, that hasn't materialized. In terms of Ukraine, over the course of the period under investigation and through the present, the conflict has continued at a slow burn, with really no end in sight, despite high-level international mediation efforts such as the one yesterday in Berlin. But in our view in the book, full implementation of the Minsk agreement remains unlikely. Two other, in fact, scenarios seem more plausible. The first and most likely is a prolongation or moderate intensification of the status quo, neither war nor peace, but a calibrated, simmering conflict without major escalation. This would be a war of attrition that over time Moscow would eventually win. But it should be noted, Russia has a track record of rash behavior in this crisis, starting with the invasion and annexation of Crimea in early 2014. And it remains possible, therefore, that you could see another major military escalation in eastern Ukraine, and that, of course, would be a sort of second scenario. But the long-term outcomes of both of these scenarios are relatively similar. Should either come to pass, Ukraine eventually would be forced to reintegrate the Donbass on Russia's terms. And the key difference between those two scenarios is time. In the first, the end game takes months or even years to materialize. In the second, it could happen as soon as Putin gives the order. In either case, tragically, Ukrainians would pay the price. There would be further conflict. The Ukrainian economy would continue its downward spiral. And the government's pledges of reform and clean governance would seem increasingly empty. So both of these conflicts have reinforced and deepened the sort of new Cold War dynamic in Russia's relations with the West. And developments in the last few weeks and months, including, of course, the hacking of a number of U.S. political actors involved in the election, in the view that is presented in the book, and in my view as well, is an acceleration of problems that have been worsening in the broader relationship since 2014. And it seems now inevitable that we're in for a period of protracted conflictual relations between Russia and the West. Now, it should be noted that since the beginning of 2014, there has been an attempt at what I would call compartmentalization, that is trying to isolate those areas where both sides saw the potential for shared interests and cooperation from their increasingly intensifying conflicts. The most prominent example, of course, was the Iranian nuclear deal itself, which required at its core U.S.-Russia cooperation in order to work. But I think what we've seen in the last few weeks is that compartmentalization is falling apart. It was always a very difficult political balance to maintain from the beginning, and now everything seems to be negatively linked to everything else. In other words, nothing can be accomplished because conflict in one area is dragging down any potential cooperation in another. So I'm happy to address the other drivers that I mentioned or get into more detail on those three, but I'll hand it over to my colleagues now.
Is it on? It's on. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the Middle East and North Africa. It goes almost without saying that this region is experiencing sustained instability. Hovering over it is strategic rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which I'd say over the last couple of years has heightened and sharpened. There are several war zones, the most prominent of which is Syria, where the humanitarian crisis has intensified, ceasefires have collapsed, and the diplomatic process has atrophied or at least stagnated. Other problem areas include Yemen and Libya, and exacerbating the difficulties in all three countries, of the countries I just mentioned, as well as Iraq, is the activity of the Islamic State, known as ISIS or ISIL, which in June 2014 declared a regional caliphate and has displaced, I would say, al-Qaeda as the world's main, or certainly most prominent jihadist threat. ISIS-related radicalism has also increased instability in countries bordering Syria, namely Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. So this is it's a problem that spreads. The United States remains the key major power in the region, with the qualification that it's pulled back strategically and, chastened by its experience in Iraq, is resisting deep military involvement. In turn, as Sam detailed, Russia has asserted itself as a geopolitical player in the Middle East via its intervention in Syria. That said, I don't think the news is all bad. The Iran nuclear deal does appear to be holding, though it remains a source of tension within and outside of Iran. The U.S.-led air campaign against ISIS and support for Syrian opposition groups have substantially diminished ISIS's territory in both Syria and Iraq, prompting ISIS to dial back affirmations of the caliphate and its writ, something that hasn't come up in the presidential debates that much for one reason or the other. Although I don't know why Hillary hasn't asserted it more. With Manbij and Dabiq having fallen in Syria and Ramadi and Fallujah in Iraq, the takedown of Mosul underway, and the ouster of ISIS from the self-declared Syrian capital of Raqqa perhaps on the horizon, prospects for effective regional containment of ISIS seem, at least tentatively, fairly good. The recent expulsion of ISIS from its Libyan stronghold in Sirte is also salutary. A major worry, of course, is that a flattened state-building and recruiting trajectory for ISIS in the Middle East will prompt a further increase in out-of-area attacks directed or inspired by ISIS in Europe, and to a lesser extent the United States, and raise the requirements for homeland security. And getting back to the Syria crisis, which is obviously the headline one, and the one of most immediate concern, politically managing it remains a very stiff challenge, obviously. Strategically, for instance, Washington has to weigh very fraught, limited military options for humanitarian intervention against the possibility of Russian brinkmanship and escalation, which could wind up getting both countries into a full-blown proxy war. Obama's prohibitively likely successor, I'd say at this point, Hillary Clinton, has indicated that she would militarily lean farther forward in Syria, and I think even she admitted last night that that would be risky in terms of potential escalation. Operationally, the United States has to balance Turkey's often competing interests in countering ISIS on one hand and constraining Syrian Kurds' capabilities and territorial gains on the other. Just an example of the cross-cutting difficulties that external actors face in managing Syria. Meanwhile, al-Qaeda hasn't gone away. It's closely linked to the Syrian jihadist group Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, formerly known as Jabhat al-Nusra, which has gained traction in the country. In Yemen, while preferring a diplomatic track and concerned about humanitarian strife, Washington has tepidly supported the Saudi and UAE-led coalition's offensive against Iran-supported Houthi rebels in order to soothe, in order to soothe Riyadh's irritation over the Iran nuclear deal and its irritation over American pressure to calibrate support for potentially jihadist Syrian rebels. The United States is both at risk and leery of being drawn into deeper conflict, the potential for which was illustrated last week when U.S. Navy ships deployed in the Red Sea retaliated against attempted Houthi missile strikes by destroying radar sites with cruise missiles. Problems abound elsewhere. For instance, the attempted coup in Turkey, as well as a resurgent Kurdish separatist movement and ISIS infiltration of Turkey, has prompted a domestic crackdown that could intensify dissent and ultimately the country's stability, or impair the country's stability. So, just in closing, an American strategic rebalancing to East Asia makes sense in the long term. U.S. interests and leverage in the Middle East have diminished, and the Obama administration has staunchly resisted deep military commitments in the region. Yet, persistent crises and the United States' durable residual interests and perceived obligations there will almost certainly keep the Middle East high among the next American president's foreign policy priorities. I'm going to leave it there.
Good morning. I'd like now to turn to Sub-Saharan Africa. When we discuss Sub-Saharan Africa, we tend to do so through the prism of conflict. And indeed, if we look at the developments of the past year, we see a continuation of violence across the continent, from Mali all the way to Somalia. However, there are three other trends, very significant trends, I would say, that I'd like to highlight today. But the first one concerns the need to revise our narrative about Africa. For years, we have spoken about Africa in terms of the conflict-ridden continent. Then, in the latter part of the 2000s, we started talking about Africa's rise. Well, this year's strategic survey asked the question, is Africa really rising? Well, there are a number of domestic problems that affect African countries, but the region has also suffered quite substantially as a result of global trends, such as the falling commodity prices and the slowdown in the Chinese economy, which has in turn resulted in a decline in Chinese demand for African natural resources, primarily minerals. In addition to that, for a number of years, the optimism surrounding Africa and Africa's rise was linked to the notion that Africa had a fast-growing middle class. Well, new studies that have emerged recently indicate that we might have greatly overestimated the size of the African middle class. According to some studies, we might have overestimated it by a factor of 17. And we've also failed to acknowledge that the middle class is very much concentrated in a small handful of countries, saying that about 25% of the African middle class is in South Africa alone. So this trend has proven particularly problematic for traditional African heavyweights such as Angola, Nigeria, or South Africa. They all had to adopt and introduce some pretty radical spending caps, which had a number of repercussions, including those countries' ability to take a more engaged role in military operations across the continent. The second trend I'd like to highlight today concerns the many attempts to undermine democratic process in a number of African countries. From Burundi, where the president ran from a third term, to Chad, where President Deby, who had already been in power since 1990, sought a re-election. We saw that in Congo-Brazzaville, where the president was re-elected, despite having been in power for 33 years already. We saw that in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where the President Kabila was surprised to stay in office beyond the constitutional limits. This is actually part of a broader trend. If we look at the period between 2010 and 2015, 16 heads of state have tried to change the constitution and remove term limits. 10 of those 16 have been successful. So it's interesting to see over the past year how the African Union has positioned itself vis-a-vis this trend. What we saw is that the African Union has showed solidarity towards some of the most controversial political figures in Africa. For instance, by appointing Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe as the chairman of the African Union for 2015, and also by backing Uganda President Museveni as a mediator in the Burundian crisis, while Museveni himself had been in power since 1986. So I'm sure you can see the contradiction there. The third trend relates to new forms of foreign involvement in the African continent. I've already alluded to Chinese interest, economic interest in Africa. Well, it's interesting to see that the economic slowdown in China hasn't had a significant impact on the strategic relations between China and its African partners. On the contrary, their relationship has changed, has matured, has deepened and broadened. We see that relationship is no longer intended in terms of concessional loans and natural resources, although natural resources remain quite important. But instead, the new relationship is defined in terms of investments. In addition to that, we can see that China is taking a growing interest in security, including by pledging $100 million support over 5 years for the African standby force. This shift, or rather diversification in Chinese attitude towards Africa, started a few years back when, in 2013, China deployed a small force protection unit to Mali. Then last year, Beijing deployed the first ever Chinese infantry battalion to a peacekeeping operation when it sent to South Sudan. And in November last year, it took a further step into this direction when it signed a 10-year lease with Djibouti to set up a military base there. And that's the first time ever that China has established a military base overseas. Djibouti is in a very strategic position for anti-terrorism and anti-piracy operations. And of course has significant American presence, that's where the largest permanent presence of the United States is in Africa. It has significant French presence and also Japanese. And only the other week, the Japanese have confirmed that they wanted to expand their existing military presence in Djibouti in order to counterbalance growing Chinese influence in the region. But there are other actors who are looking at Djibouti. Saudi Arabia has also indicated it would like to set up military facilities over there. And again, given Djibouti's proximity to Yemen, it is ideally located as a base for Saudi anti-ISIS operations. And also, Eritrea and Sudan have strengthened their ties with Riyadh over the past year. So all in all, we are seeing new forms of foreign involvement that go beyond traditional partners. And even those countries, such as China, who have been there in Africa for some time, are looking at new ways of defining their own relationship with African counterparts. Well, I'm done, actually.
We can hear you.
I can start.
So the regional focus that takes up much of strategic survey is preceded by some essays on overarching issues. None of the essays nor none of the regional chapters have bylines. They're all IISS products, but it won't surprise you that I had something to do with the essay on the drift away from nuclear disarmament. It was drafted back in May, right after President Obama visited Hiroshima and gave a heartfelt speech. And that speech in Hiroshima can be characterized as one bookend of a nuclear policy legacy that started with great promise with Obama's speech at Prague 7 years earlier when he called for a world free of nuclear weapons. In between these two bookends, you could say that the actual progress toward the goal of disarmament amounts to a pretty slim book. But there were some significant achievements. I would say there were three. Early on in the administration, the conclusion of the New START treaty with Moscow that reduced the number of deployed strategic warheads and delivery systems. The 2015 deal with Iran to bottle up Iran's nuclear weapons options for the next decade or more, if the deal holds. And then the security of civilian nuclear facilities worldwide has been strengthened due to the attention given to them by Obama's 4 nuclear security summits. But the disappointments are greater. The impact of the last nuclear security summit was diminished by a Russian boycott for the reasons that Sam mentioned. Also, although the summits encouraged enhanced security for all nuclear materials, they offered no specific measures for the 83% of such materials that are in the non-civilian sector. And even for civilian nuclear facilities, there's still no legally binding comprehensive international security standards. There are no arms control talks between the United States and Russia, which together account for 93% of the world's 15,000 nuclear weapons. And while New START reduced warhead limits by 1/3 compared with previous treaties, overall, U.S. nuclear forces have been reduced by only 13% under Obama's watch, the least reductions of any U.S. president since the end of the Cold War. Russia's interventions in Ukraine and loose talk of nuclear war fighting sparked commentaries about a new nuclear arms race and a return to the Cold War. Nuclear modernization programs by both of the superpowers, in fact, by all of the nuclear armed states, as well as mutual accusations of violating earlier agreements, left arms control in limbo, if not decay. And there's been a marked increase in most of the nuclear challenges that confronted Obama when he took office. The worst of these posed by North Korea, whose program is rapidly expanding. There's been no break in the nuclear arms competition in South Asia. There's been no progress in implementing the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty or in overcoming the impasse in negotiations on a fissile material cutoff treaty. So in Europe, Northeast Asia, and South Asia, the pendulum is swinging away from disarmament. But in the rest of the world, the vast majority of states would have it otherwise. You know, in the United Kingdom, Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn's anti-nuclear stance made him an outlier, even within among his own members of parliament. But elsewhere in the world, he would have found himself in good company. Most countries seek to hold the nuclear armed states to their obligation under the NPT to eliminate nuclear arsenals. And many nations, particularly those in the southern hemisphere, want a deadline for this process. The global push for disarmament has taken a new dimension with an increasing emphasis on the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons use. 127 nations have endorsed a pledge to fill the legal gap for the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. But the nuclear armed states are having nothing to do with it. And opposition to such legislation until conditions are ripe is one of the few areas where Russia and the nuclear-armed Western adversaries actually agree. So if arms control is to have a future in the foreseeable future, may need to prioritize unilateral measures. In the face of Russia's belligerent nuclear rhetoric, however, a one-sided U.S. move toward disarmament would be seen as a weakness to be exploited. So the situation calls for negotiated measures if only both sides were willing to negotiate, and Moscow, frankly, doesn't show much interest in doing so. Now, I have to say, nuclear is not the only arms control realm. There's a critical need to devise future rules for the use of new nano, cyber, and space technologies. In the nuclear realm, perhaps the best that can be achieved for now is the preservation of past gains. And even that's dicey, keeping Russia in the INF Treaty despite the accusations of cheating, keeping Russia in adherence with its CTBT pledge, as well as extending New START beyond 2021. I think that will be on the agenda of the next U.S. president. If the next U.S. president is not Hillary Clinton, no prediction is safe. The nuclear order would be in for a dangerous shakeup. But the probabilities of that look less likely than they were back in May when the essay was drafted.
So, thank you, Mark. Turn now to questions.
Yeah, sorry, we'll turn to questions, and I'm going to moderate the questions, and we might have some coming in over the Twitter. So back in the back, if you just state your name and affiliation.
Thank you. Hi, good morning. Alex Sanchez, right for Jane's Defense Weekly. Last week, Minister Shoigu of Russia declared that talks are underway for Russia to open bases in Vietnam, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba even. Russia already has a training center in Nicaragua. So I guess my question is, first of all, what do you think about that statement about Russia's power projection outside its near abroad and even outside its Middle East? If it's a serious statement or if it's something that's just talk that Russia has to say now and then? And I guess the second part of the question will be, you already talked about how China has a base in Djibouti, Russia is opening bases in Syria, maybe other places. Are we going back to this kind of old school geopolitics where global powers and even regional powers have to open bases abroad to demonstrate just how powerful they are? Thank you.
Sam, this is for you.
I heard the deputy defense minister talking about reopening the stations in Vietnam and Cuba, but I didn't hear about the other ones that you mentioned in Central America. In any case, I think one thing that was telling was the way Vietnam reacted, which was thanks but no thanks. It did seem like a statement made in peak at a moment of the height of U.S.-Russia tensions in the last few weeks, without a particular operational plan to realize it. We should understand the context in which Russia abandoned those bases in 2001. It was very much in an attempt to sort of solidify at the time what was post 9/11 a increasingly close relationship. Frankly, the prospect of either of those basing arrangements being renewed does seem remote, and at the end of the day, even if they were to be, we would be back to where we were in 2001 and not in some, dramatically different strategic context. Neither of these were massive bases in the sense that we think about, U.S. bases in Germany or Japan. The other factor here, and it would be useful to consult the latest military balance in this context, is Russia's power projection capabilities, which are, in fact, limited. As we've seen with the Syria operation, they've had to resort to some quite unconventional methods to supply their people and materiel on the ground, including using a lot of sort of makeshift cargo ships. The airlift and global power projection capabilities that the United States has is really just something that Russia cannot hope to match. And in that context, each of these overseas engagements are both more taxing on the broader military budget and capabilities and forces some innovation, but also ultimately have limits, because if it were to be a full-blown, for example, intervention with far more capabilities on the ground in Syria, it would really require the kind of power projection capabilities that Russia today just doesn't have.
Stanley Roth?
No, I think it's.
Hi, Stanley Roth, no affiliation. Well, I think the Middle East and Africa may have the unhappy distinction of having the hottest regions right now in terms of conflict, casualties, and damage. In terms of flashpoints, when I think about 2017, I worry most about the Asia-Pacific region. So I haven't had a chance to read the survey yet. I don't know if it discusses or rates the flashpoints. But in terms of North Korea, we're now seeing specialists talk about preemption. Wasn't even on the agenda, or talked about 6 months ago. We have both South China Sea and East China Sea, with no indication, while Duterte's in China today or yesterday, whatever, how that's going to play out. Is there a diplomatic solution, or is this just China waiting for the U.S. election to do something? And then maybe the black swan, Taiwan, where the PRC has taken a surprisingly hard line, despite the efforts of the new regime in Taipei to downplay the independence issue. So how do you see the flashpoint risk in the Asia-Pacific region in 2017? Maybe that's you as well, Mark, given your Korea expertise.
Adam, do you have any thoughts on that? Or should I? Yeah.
I mean, I think the South China Sea dispute obviously has to be somewhere near the top of the register of concerns there. I mean, you just have to look at the characteristics of what is going on there. It's a set of zero-sum sovereignty claims in a context where regional institutions capable of addressing those challenges are weak or non-existent, where the principle of external mediation and arbitration is not universally accepted, and in one case, as was mentioned earlier, has been rejected. It's taking place against a wider backdrop of geopolitical competition between major powers that gives the dispute wider totemic significance. There is a rising tide of nationalism in the region. There is military modernization, which suggests that faith is being put by countries in the region on questions of military deterrence or the ability to coerce, rather than on the active evolution of greater dispute settlement, dispute resolution settlement instruments. There's an unhelpful action-reaction dynamic, and it's the characteristic of what we're seeing, that everybody actually presents themselves as reacting to somebody else, and to that extent, it does have the features of a classic security dilemma, which is aggravated by what I mentioned earlier about the confluence of tactical and principled interests. So I think what is key is for the US and China to avoid respective traps that they're likely to fall into. For the Chinese is to avoid the nationalism trap, where they are backed into a corner, where having made an issue of this, the population turns around and says, so what are you going to do about this? Are you going to stand for this or not? I think there's a recognition in China that nationalism is a double-edged sword, that it's absolutist, it's unforgiving, and it's something to be handled with great care. But the temptation to resort to it has seemed to be rather overpowering, and in a context of mounting economic and debt difficulties in China, that doesn't seem likely to abate. The US has to avoid what one could call a credibility trap. It's being prodded and poked by a number of allies to demonstrate on a continual basis that it has credibility and that it needs to assert itself against Chinese intrusions and assertiveness in the South China Sea. So if the two of them can be sensitive to that and to avoid those traps, then I think there's something to be hoped for. But I think this is not something that we can be complacent about.
And just to add on North Korea, I mean, when the book was drafted, already we were in a position of North Korea having been ramping up both its nuclear and missile programs, and the challenge was getting worse and worse. And then in the period after the book went to print, it even got worse. It even got more accelerated. And it was predicted that talk of preemption would be in the air. But to the extent to which it's being talked about today, no. I was interviewed yesterday by a South Korean newspaper, and they seemed to think that Washington was about ready to launch something against North Korea. I said, no. I mean, preemption is something that the military, the Pentagon, has to plan for in the event of North Korea looking like it's going to be attacking. But I can't imagine that the United States would unilaterally launch a preemptive attack against North Korea. Would South Korea do so? There's some concerns about that, but I think there's some exaggeration in the air right now. Certainly, though, North Korea will have to be on the top of the agenda of the next president. Don Daniel, and then here in front. And then we'll go to the other side.
Thank you very much. Don Daniel, Emeritus Professor at Georgetown. I'm curious to go back to China. It was mentioned here about Taiwan possibly being a black swan, and I'm wondering whether or not China might be as much of a black swan. I mean, its numbers relative to its growth, I don't think can be accepted with any credibility. They are not by many people, including the Beige Book and so forth, that there's something that the numbers are jiggered. Also, there's the issue of the debt overhang, particularly the debt overhang at the expense of the state, not at the expense of the private banks and the private industry and so forth. And if so, I mean, are we looking to China having some kind of a 2008 event, if I could put it this way? And what would that mean for its defense spending? What would that mean for its assertiveness in the area? Would it kind of rein in, or would it kind of become even more bold?
Thanks. Bring the microphone to the front, Sam, if you would, for the next question. And
Probably, Adam, this is yours again. Thank you very much. I mean, on the question of Taiwan, obviously it is a source of grave disappointment to China that after many years of cultivating the warming down government in Taipei that it's been succeeded by one that comes from the pro-independence tradition. So I think you're right to say that Taiwan, after a number of years when it was off the agenda in many respects, and in which the international community wasn't really paying too great an attention to it, in which China could present the matter as being sucked into its orbit and dealt with as an internal matter, that has now changed. The new president, Tsai Ing-wen, has not had the most provocative positions that she's taken on this issue, but clearly it's a rather a distinctive contrast to what has gone before. As I say, nationalism is on the rising tide in China, not just in respect of the South China Sea, but also in respect of Taiwan. And this could also be a point at which the government in Beijing feels under increasing public pressure to assert its position. The question is really whether the two sides can agree on a level of strategic ambiguity that has served in the past, where they both have a different understanding of what the situation of their relationship is between them. If they can do that on terms that are presentable to their respective publics, then there's some hope for stability. But it seems that that process of arriving at any kind of an agreement to disagree has still got some way to travel. In respect to what you say about China itself, yes, there are mounting economic problems. Yes, there is increasing amount of debt. The death of the Communist Party and its rule in China has often been foretold, and I would caution against that. But I think what makes a particular period now interesting is that we're seeing somewhat of a transition rather to a different kind of political arrangement. We've moved away from the classic sort of collective leaderships that was most evidently typified in the administration of Hu Jintao to something where Xi Jinping is publicly seen as at the core of the leadership. He is concentrating more power in his hands. Other senior positions, apparently including that of the Prime Minister, have to some extent been not subverted but undermined through this process of an increasing accumulation of power in Xi Jinping's hands. So the question is, does the new kind of political complexion which China is taking allow for what China really needs, which is continual and massive infusions of bureaucratic competence to keep the show on the road? And in a situation in which there are conflicting signals about who is in charge and what he wants and how this is to be implemented, and in which the normal and existing structures are undergoing some process of evolution, I think that's a question that is likely to come more to the fore. I think if China does begin to hit the buffers economically, or if there are other kinds of political tensions, it seems to me more likely that there'll be greater assertiveness on foreign policy than less.
Thanks, Adam. In the front, and then we'll go in the middle. And then...
Good morning. Thank you for being here, first of all. My name is Maria Clara Ludovici. I'm an intern for the American Legislative Exchange Council. So my question is related to Homeland Security. So you, Mr. Stevenson, you were talking about, of course, the raising requirement for Homeland Security. But this question maybe can be answered to by all of you guys, because I was thinking, how can the Homeland Security be improved? I think you guys are doing a very good job, because eventually the airport are very secured, and especially in the United States, it's very hard for an international to get and pass the border. So I'm thinking that the majority of all these terrorists are Americans, or like, let's say successful terrorists, unfortunately, are from the countries where they're doing these attacks, so Americans or Europeans. So how can the Homeland Security be useful in that sense? How can this be improved? Thank you.
Okay, try this.
Hello? How's that? Okay. I mean, I think the short answer to the question is that there is no magic bullet, and there's probably no new type of measure that can be added to the current menu that was developed after 9/11 to protect the homeland to a greater extent. I mean, obviously, you know, attacks like the one in San Bernardino, for example, and in Nice, and in Orlando, those are done. I mean, to the extent that there's any link with an international terrorist group, it's inspirational rather than operational. So, and it's very difficult to deter them, and even to detect them. I mean, if there's somebody who's already suspected of links and who's on a terrorist watch list or under some kind of surveillance by a domestic law enforcement agency, then obviously they can expand their range, they can loosen their criteria for further investigation. That might have helped in at least one of those attacks. But I don't think there is any magic bullet. I also think that, despite some of the campaign rhetoric you hear, the connection between particularly vetted refugees and terrorist attacks is extremely attenuated, if there's a correlation at all. So again, I think very restrictive refugee and immigration policies aren't necessarily the answer either.
Thanks, Jonathan. A gentleman on the third row from the back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. May I ask two brief questions? Is that?
Okay.
Oh. John Gizzi, Chief Political Correspondent for Newsmax and Newsmax Television, and I will be brief. First, for the general panel, we've seen in Europe the incredible rise in Western democracies of nationalist/populist parties. Germany's AfD, Austria may well elect a president from the Freedom Party this year, and France, of course, Marine Le Pen. Do you see any of these movements coming to power in either Western or Eastern Europe and enhancing Putin's hand in Europe? My second question is for Virginia. Thank you all for your presentation. What seems to be happening in Africa that no one is saying is that the actuarial tables are going to affect great change, as well as other circumstances. Robert Mugabe is 94 years old. Zuma clearly is going to face a challenge from a new political party and new movement for the first time. The African National Congress is holding a meeting. President Buhari of Nigeria is 73. I could go on. When the old guard, the old elephants of Africa finally fade, and the history of nationalism, revolution behind them, is there a political class that is trained in economics and public administration that can come up and move Africa into the 21st century?
Thank you. Maybe, Nicholas, you could take out your crystal ball and predict right-wing parties in Europe.
Yeah, thank you. One thing to note at the start is there are already a few sympathetic ears for Vladimir Putin within European councils. I'm thinking some of the Central European members, not Poland, obviously, but if you look into Hungary, if you look to Hungary, then you see Viktor Orban is much less of a fan of economic sanctions on Russia than some of the North European members. So I think already around Europe there are some constituencies that are fairly sympathetic. Difficult, obviously, to predict elections. I wouldn't like to say how they go, but the bigger problem is almost whether part of that agenda, and this is not only limited to Western Europe, whether part of that agenda leads across into more mainstream politics and has an influence on that. One of our colleagues, who's a German national, is very fond now of saying that without Angela Merkel, there might not be much of a European united front. Now, it wouldn't take that many more crises, I would imagine, in Germany to unseat her, even if it's not the AfD that is actually doing it.
Virginia, you've got the...
Thank you, John, for your question. Absolutely, we can see an aging leadership across the African continent. Part of this has to do with the respect that is often associated with the elderly and within African societies. Yes, you ask a very pertinent question: what will happen when this generation will go away. I think we can see across the continent some positive indicators, because although I mentioned in my remarks that we might have overestimated the size of the middle class, we do have growing elites that are often foreign, I would say Western educated. Of course, these people are often unlikely to be fully representatives of the societies in which they live, because they lead very different lives. I'm thinking, for instance, of the many very wealthy Nigerians who are study and work in London and other European cities and in the US, and then eventually they go back to their country to take up very senior positions. So we do have a cadre of elite or the children of the elite that is getting ready to take up those posts. For instance, we see in cases such as Angola, where President Dos Santos has been in a way grooming his own daughter, who is probably, I believe she's the richest woman across the African continent. She owns many businesses, including in Europe and in Portugal in particular, to be part of the next generations of leaders. We saw that in Senegal, we saw that in Liberia, where the children of the current political elites have been groomed already.
Thanks, Virginia. Ed Ift. Oh, good. We've got a few questions here.
Thank you. Edward Ift, State Department and Georgetown University. A comment, I guess, a question for Samuel. The Russian hacking into democratic election emails is being presented as an attempt by the Russians to throw the election to Trump. I don't believe that's the case. I don't think the Russians would be enthusiastic about a Trump presidency. I think their motive is to tarnish and at least a little bit delegitimize the American political process, democracy as practiced by the Americans. Now, good job of that ourselves already. But we've been criticizing and ridiculing Russian democracy for a long time. And that even has the effect of calling into question the legitimacy of Putin himself. And their response, I suggest, is to say, well, democracy as practiced by the Americans is not the textbook version either. Consider what happened last year. There was a big scandal about Russian athletes taking illegal drugs, and a lot of them were banned from the Olympics. What was the Russian response? It was to hack into medical records and leak them so that they could say, well, Western and particularly American athletes are not clean either. Everybody's doing this. I think the parallel is quite striking. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. You want to, I mean, that wasn't the question so much as a comment. Do you want to?
A couple of things.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay, good. We'll have some debate here.
I think fundamentally I agree with you, Ed, on this issue of, broadly speaking, if you want to pick two motives, directly supporting one candidate or this sort of discrediting of the process and the we'll do to you what you did to us kind of thing. I think that more, at least it makes more sense. However, it's important to note that Trump has said a lot of nice things about Russia in a political environment where nobody really else is saying those kinds of things, including his own vice presidential candidate. I think the Russians are watching what has been said and seeing somebody say nice things about them, who's running for who's the presidential candidate of a major U.S. political party, doubtless would prefer that to alternatives. Now, motives in these kinds of situations, when there's a lot of murkiness around, levels of authorization, the nature of the operation itself, are hard to divine. But what is clear is that at this point, some of this is out of the Russian government's hands, right? You have intermediaries running the show right now, and I'm thinking specifically of WikiLeaks, which has its own agenda, right? Assuming that they were simply given this information, now they are deciding how to leak it out, when to leak it out, how to portray it, which emails to put first. So in a way, at this point, Russia's original motives are kind of irrelevant to the news stories because they're not actually running the operation, so to speak, anymore. I would say, though, that the strategically significant point here is that this is unprecedented, right? That
it's clear that hacking goes on all the time, particularly between major cyber powers. Russia is a major cyber power. I have no doubt that political parties and politically significant entities in both countries are hacked by the other's government's intelligence services. That's just the way of the world. What is different is the leak, right? And, we're seeing that for the first time, that there has been in the past restraint exercised, that intelligence services have kept what they have discovered to themselves. And that is no longer the case. And that suggests that the gloves have come off in a way that, they haven't before. And in the future, that could be pretty troubling as to what might develop, particularly given now the promise that the U.S. government has made of retaliation.
I've just gloss on what Sam has already articulated very well, and that is that I don't think it's either or. I think it could be both. I think that Russia has a sort of a more formal strategic agenda of casting aspersions on American democracy. I think that's probably true. But I think it, helping to install an unprincipled ignoramus with a Putin fetish in the White House would conceivably be a bonus to the Russian government.
Thanks, Jonathan. We'll go to the last two, but let me note that we've got a couple questions that have come in via the Twitter sphere. One is to you, Adam, asking for more elaboration on what you mean by United States as a selective superpower. Is it actually weaker, or is it because Obama wasn't flexing military power like his predecessor was?
I think the intention of a greater selectivity and discrimination in deciding where the U.S. needs to assert its power and to extend its interests is that it was intended, of course, as a long-term strategy for the preservation of America's position in the world. But I think we're looking at a situation in which globally events have overtaken that. In most of the regions where the U.S. has had a very strong presence, there have been rather significant incidents of high strategic importance. And the ability to sort of manage these simultaneously has clearly suffered from the vacation of strategic space that others have occupied. The U.S. is now less interventionist than it used to be, and certainly one could characterize some of its prior interventions as ill-advised. But the rest of the world has not become less interventionist, but more interventionist. We see this in Asia, we see this in the Middle East, we see this certainly in Europe. So the question is, to what extent America can now sort of stench that process in some way and reassert itself to be less reactive than it has in the recent past and to
in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, but I think more receding policy and to at least move back towards a somewhat more assertive one.
Thanks, Jonathan. Let's go back now. Gentleman in the middle there, and then we'll maybe take two, and then you, sir. So, yes, right here first.
Peter Rashers from Transnational Strategy Group. On that last point about this sort of predilection for selective withdrawal, one area where the Obama administration has been quite assertive is the International Trade and Economic Front. But involuntarily, if you look at the troubles with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the U.S. is experiencing a kind of selective withdrawal. Looking ahead, how really sort of looking at the broader strategic landscape, how significant would it be if the U.S. Either voluntarily or involuntarily is not able to assert itself on international economic issues? Is there enough other relationships we have and other fields we can play on that this really doesn't have any overall kind of strategic impact? Or do you think if this continues, if because of domestic constraints or just kind of predilection in terms of your international outlook, U.S. is not engaged on the international economic issues, is how big a deal would that be? Thank you.
Thanks very much, and we'll go take a second question here, so we can think about the first one.
Henry Newsom, Secor Holdings. I wanted to talk about the possibility of Japan and South Korea attaining a nuclear weapon, considering both the increase in instability in their region, so on the demand side with North Korea's constant problems and own program, as well as the the revival of the historic tension between Japan and China. And then on the supply side, the presumed lack of confidence in the American umbrella, considering both Obama administration's flirting with no first use and the nomination by the traditionally strong security party of a candidate who suggested that Japan and South Korea attain an independent deterrent, and that this man came probably a few dozen gaffes and a few hundred gropes away from the White House. So even if he doesn't win, it's the impact.
I'm going to take the second question first because I wrote a book about that earlier this year, and I predicted that it's unlikely to happen except under some combination of circumstances, one of which you mentioned, a perception of a loss of credibility of U.S. extended deterrence. And it's clear that candidate Trump's statements, although he walked away from them later on, but the way he talks about transactional security alliance systems has undermined credibility, at least the perception of credibility. But in terms of the actual U.S. policy of extended deterrence, there's been no deterioration. There's been a strengthening of it, both in the sharing of the policy, the interactions with the Japanese and the Korean officials at all levels, and the pivot to Asia, the more forces in the region. So,
but I'm more interested in the Korean.
Yeah, the Korean public perception is the worrisome one because of 60% of the population in repeated polls saying, yeah, we'd like nuclear weapons, please. Now, this is broad, but it's pretty shallow. More recently, there have been many politicians from the governing party in the legislature saying similar things. Now, the government of South Korea has repeatedly said, no, we're going to adhere to our NPT obligations. They know the downsides of such a course of action, which I think the politicians who talk about this don't understand the downsides. And they're pretty severe downsides. I mean, when South Korea back in the 1970s was pursuing a nuclear weapons option, Henry Kissinger told Park Chung-hee, you will lose your U.S. alliance if you can persist in this. And I don't know if a next U.S. president would be as strict as that, but it's been a consistent policy over every administration, Republican, Democratic, to put non-proliferation principles pretty high. I don't think those in South Korea who talk about this really understand the implications of violating the NPT. It's not at all a cost-free exercise. Plus, I don't think it would have the impact that they talk about. I think it would exacerbate the nuclear tension in the peninsula. North Korea would see that its claims about being encircled and threatened have been proven by such a course. So I don't think it's going to happen, but it certainly is worrisome. I think the credibility has been affected regardless of whether Trump succeeds or not. Now, Nick, over to you for the harder question.
Thank you, Peter. We have a colleague that once started an answer to your question with, I'm not sure I agree with this, but let's see how it goes and bear with me. So this is my version of that one. I was very struck last night when Hillary Clinton got the question on TPP, that she actually closed the door somewhat more. I think her formal words was, I was against it, I am against it, and I will be against it. That's interesting to me because TPP is a big part of US policy to East Asia. It's also a part of policy to China. It's a trade agreement, yes, but it obviously has political aspects to it. They were clear from the start. And without those, I think it's going to be more difficult to come up with a policy that will be internally credible and comprehensive. So I'm very interested to see how that one plays out. I wonder if a renegotiation is what you had in mind. But even renegotiations of trade agreements, as we've seen in Europe with the Europe-Canada recently, very, very difficult to pull off. I think the broader point, in a way, the ship has already sailed. I mean, the global trading system is already fracturing quite a lot. WTO is still there, it's not going away, but it's no longer the vehicle by which barriers are broken down. The big losers of that are most likely to be the poorest and weakest states. The United States will still be guardian to a fairly wealthy market in excess of 300 million people, same for the European Union. Maybe 60 million shorter in a year or two, but nevertheless, it's those actually at the bottom that I think are more likely to suffer.
Okay, thanks, Nick. We'll take the last questions. We've got one here, and then I got two that come in through the internet. So please go ahead, sir. Here's the microphone.
Dao the Moon with the Heritage Foundation. You said that U.S. Still holds a lot of power in Middle East, but strategically pulled out. So I want to know, how can we still engage without risk? And if we do use soft power, what kind of strategy does or should the new president or the foreign policy should take on?
Jonathan, before you answer that, let me pose the other two so two other of our colleagues can think about them. One is to Virginia. Could you update us on how well Buhari's early presidency in Nigeria is going? At what cost did the recent release of some of the Chibok girls by Boko Haram come? And then one about East Asia. Duterte's pledge to rebalance his country's focus to China and to put aside their South China Seas dispute in favor of bilateral engagement. What do we think about this? Jonathan, to answer the question about U.S. engagement, soft power.
In the Middle East, can you hear me now? In the Middle East, I actually didn't say we pulled out. I said we pulled back. And I'm not suggesting that the United States is going to in any wholesale way disengage from the Middle East. It's not feasible and it's not going to happen. It is true that obviously the Obama administration is very wary of using hard power there. That said, you have to put it into perspective. Well over 10,000 airstrikes on ISIS positions, leadership in an air campaign that's been very effective against ISIS, notwithstanding the fact that it may have some presence in 31 countries. And I think the application of soft power has a perception of being unsatisfying and insufficient. That said, again, in the case of Syria, soft power has been used extensively, both on the diplomatic front and on the economic front. U.S. Supplying, more aid for refugees than any other country, and also trying to help orchestrate a political process that's been admittedly frustrating. I think that the use of soft power, for lack of any other attractive alternative, will continue. It's possible, if Hillary Clinton becomes president, that she will, take a run at hard power in Syria by, as she says, imposing no-fly zones. I think she acknowledged last night that could end up being a very risky proposition and one that results in escalation that the U.S. would find difficult to, perhaps more difficult to manage than the current situation. So again, I see the U.S. pulling back, but certainly not pulling out of the Middle East. The hope is that it can leverage soft power more successfully than it has in the recent past. But whether that's true or not, it's not clear. Certain things aren't going to change. The military footprint is unlikely to change in the Middle East. The assistance programs to countries like Israel and Egypt, again, important underpinning of stability there that isn't likely to change. Especially given that Russia is now flirting with at least a sort of low-level military relationship with Egypt, which I think probably has a relatively limited trajectory. Given that if Russia were being asked to replace, say, the Saudis and the United States in terms of as a donor to Egypt, they wouldn't be able to afford the bill.
Thanks, Jonathan. Virginia, you wrote the book on Boko Haram, so this question's ideal.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, when President Buhari took office in May last year, there were very high expectations surrounding his appointment. What we see now is a Nigeria that is facing a severe economic crisis, partly because of external factors such as the fall in the oil prices, and Nigeria derives most of its revenue from oil, but also because of some of the new economic policies implemented by President Buhari. On the security front, since he took office, we've seen some significant progress that was made in the fight against Boko Haram, thanks to Nigerian efforts, but also the efforts of its neighbors, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. So we see now Boko Haram that is diminished.
and is no longer able to sustain a fully fledged insurgency campaign, but still very much capable of launching terrorist attacks and terrorizing the population. What we've seen in the course of the past summer is a splintering within Boko Haram, a faction of which remains loyal to the original leader Abu Bakr Shekau, and the other faction that is affiliated to the Islamic State. It was, of course, a very positive development when 21 of the Chibok girls were recently released. I'm very happy for their family, but there are hundreds of other civilians who remain in the hands of Boko Haram. They don't make the headlines anymore, and of course the Chibok girls are the ones who focus the international attention. There are still lots of young men who have been forced to join Boko Haram ranks, and also women and children who have been kidnapped to act as sex slaves, suicide bombers, or to perform support functions for Boko Haram. I think there is still a long way to go before we see stability in northern Nigeria, and the country and its neighbors are facing a humanitarian crisis with 1.2 million displaced people, lots of people living in refugee camps in appalling conditions, and even the ones who have been saved and rescued are facing huge problems going back to their communities, owing to the stigma and the trauma that follows from their dreadful experience. So still a long way to go, I would say.
Thanks, Virginia. Adam, can you have the panel last question about the Philippines, China?
Sure. Well, obviously, the relationship between the United States and the Philippines is a long-standing and historic one, and the Philippines has been a major non-NATO ally of the United States, although one perhaps shouldn't ascribe too much strategic significance to that. So clearly, it's something to take note of, and it fits into a pattern in which China has certainly attempted to, it seems, take steps to peel away Cambodia, Laos, and Brunei from wider ASEAN positions, particularly with respect to developments in the South China Sea. It's conceivable that this latest development may embolden China in that effort, but I think it seems to me also that this decision to distance from the United States is an eminently reversible one, and that the conditions are maybe particularly sui generis as far as this particular president is concerned. I'm also conscious of the fact that Chinese preferences when it comes to strategic partners, or even more so allies, is what they like is no surprises, predictability, steadiness, solid temperament. I'm not sure that those are traits and characteristics we would necessarily associate with His Excellency, the President of the Philippines. So the phrase, with friends like these, does spring to mind.
Well, thanks very much, Adam, and we'll close on that note. Thanks very much for joining this launch of a strategic survey. I think my British colleagues were glad that there were no questions about Brexit, but they're available to talk about that afterwards. And as I said, the books are on sale. 5 of us don't have our names as authors, bylines, but Nick Redman, as the editor, has his name, and I'm sure he'll be willing to sign the multiple copies that you all will be buying afterwards. Thanks very much. Please join me in thanking the panelists.
Hi, how are you? Good to see you.
Very good. Off to the World Bank shortly after 1, but between now and then.